Hi, thank you all for coming. I want to thank Lauri for making the trip up here, Paula for introducing us to Lauri, and also the foundations that give us the grant money that allow us to do programming. You know, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation and the Fairfield Foundation. And we're excited to have our author readings able to be in person now, and Lauri has a presentation for us also about her experiences. So I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jody. It's a pleasure, Paula and Paul, for introducing me to this part of the country and to the opportunity to be in this wonderful library here in Becket. This is particularly timely and important and symbolic to me because this is the day before Juneteenth, the day that we celebrate the end of slavery in America. And that's very special. And I'm glad to be able to do this on that particular weekend when it's celebrated. And now is a federal holiday, thanks to Joe Biden. Also, it's very special, which I discovered through Paul, is that Great Barrington was a place where W.B. Du Bois has roots. And it so happens that the foreword to my book was written by a former classmate at Vassar College, who was a fabulous writer and who encouraged me to write this book. And she started the book, the foreword actually quotes, guess who? W.B. Du Bois. So all of these coincidences, which I never feel are coincidences, I think they're meant to happen. And it's about Black women and his opinion of Black women, which also is quite appropriate as I stand here. It's quite complimentary. I don't even want to be able to claim any of what he has said here, but it says that, but what of Black women? Question. I most sincerely doubt if any other race of women could have brought its fineness up through so devilish a fire. And the use of the term fineness, or the word, is really quite interesting. And the fact that this is what he wrote in those years. So anyway, being in this area, being able to go to Great Barrington tomorrow, I think, being here at this library in Becket, and being here for Juneteenth, it all kind of comes together in a very special way. So I'm grateful for all of you and for this opportunity. I will go through and share a few things from the book. It's called Dancing in the Dash, and you will see a sculpture up in the right corner. And that sculpture is one that I am proud to own. And particularly as I stand here in front of my friend Paula Stern, who's a sculptor and a fabulous one. She did not do this one, but it was done by an African-American artist named Tina Allen. And Tina Allen has passed a few years ago, and she's from California. And it is quite a sculpture in that it's rather imposing. And I will tell you why I felt it was important to put it on the cover of the book. And I write about it on the first pages of the book. Balance is a critical requirement for success in life and in ballet. A 6-foot-tall sculpture dominates a special place in my home called Eclipse. It's a tall bronze sculpture of a dancer perched atop a large ball. The muscular body is molded into a stylized arabesque, the demi-point of the supporting leg balancing on the globe. The 3-foot-tall bronze sculpture is mounted on the 3-foot-tall rotating marble base. The late African-American artist, Tina Allen, created this defining and imposing work. It serves as a constant reminder to me of graceful power and of the strength, delicate precision, and tenuousness of balance. So my book has that statue on the cover. Further, the name of the book, Dancing in the Dash, which many people ask me, what's that significance of dancing in the dash? And is this a book about dance? And the answer is no. The book is a memoir, so it's a story of my life, and I did not dance throughout my life, but ballet was a very important part of what became, what was a formulating and forming part of who I am and what my career trajectory was. And so dancing in the dash, I did not want to write a memoir that was, I was born on such a date and I did this and I did that. So I call this a creative memoir. And perhaps I'm taking liberties by assuming that it's creative, but I believe it's a creative memoir because I combine many different aspects of art. The art of writing, the art of dancing. I have poetry in it. I have lyrics from songs. And I have wonderful quotes from very influential people in my life. So I call it a combined media performance art memoir. And in that sense, every title of each chapter is a dance term. Welcome. Is a dance term or the name of a ballet or of a step. And in that chapter, I relate the chapter name to an event or events in my life. So I also use the term dash for two reasons. One, which is often referred to, and there's a poem about it, and at some funerals, on tombstones, on obituaries, you find the date of birth with a dash and the date of death. And poems have been written, eulogies have been given that talk about the importance of living in your dash, living in that time between birth and death, and not just focusing when you give a eulogy, you talk about someone's life, about when they were born and when they die. The other concept of dash for me is my sense throughout my life that I was running a 100-yard dash, that when I approached the finish line, it would move further down the track. And I think that many of us have felt that in our lives, men and women, when you are striving for perfection, to do more, to keep running that race, to push yourself constantly. I particularly felt that for a lot of reasons in my life, and some of them I talk about in this book. So that's kind of an intro to, so I'm going to go and move to some of the other themes in the book, which I consider very important. And some of those themes have to do with family. And I came from, I believe, a very special kind of family. I had two parents in the home all of my life. My father is still alive. He turned 90 2 months ago. Norman Fitz, who was a big influence and continues to be a big influence in my life. He was from a little town in North Carolina called Warrenton. I spent many summers there that influenced me, where I experienced segregation. The town was divided into the white section and the black section. And many of the things that I experienced as a child influenced me, how I felt about race, about relationships. The Ku Klux Klan marched down Main Street. My father took me to see that because he wanted me to see the Klan. There were events in my family where my uncle was chased out of town by the Ku Klux Klan and moved north to New York. My grandparents were part of the Great Migration, went from the south to the north. My mother was from an area that I still live in, Prince George's County, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. And 2 generations before her lived on the same street where my grandmother lived and where I would spend time on weekends and in the summer. My father was quite a Renaissance man. He was an actor and a ranked tennis player, but his major in university was zoology, and he wanted to be a doctor. But those passions ended up being very important. This is a picture of him in Antigone. As a child, I learned Shakespeare and Greek tragedy from cueing my dad, his lines for plays. And he did do Shakespeare in those days. When we talk about Black people playing roles in the classics and Shakespeare and in roles that were not traditionally, and not just Othello, okay, that this happened way back in the 50s and even before. So when we make so much about Black people playing in traditionally white roles in plays on Broadway and everywhere, it's been happening for years. The Howard players at Howard University always did Shakespeare and Greek tragedy and traveled around the country way back when. My mother also went to Howard University. They met there. And she majored in English and minored in Spanish, which was quite rare for an African-American woman to major in Spanish language when back in the 50s. And she really instilled in me and my brothers a sense of internationalism, of love for foreign languages, of studying beyond our own cultures. So that's something that that has been part of my life. And ironically, I'll say to some of you that what she wanted me to do to stay in the international realm, she advised me to become a stewardess, as they were called then, flight attendant, because she thought that was an opportunity to see the world. Other things that I think, this is my own family. My youngest daughter, Brianna, who lives in Scotland, and my son, Fernando, on the left, and a grandson, David George, and Luana, who is the sister of Fernando. And I say it that way because I inherited those two when I married their father. And I don't like to say stepchildren because I don't believe in the word step. And it has, unfortunately, a negative connotation many times in this country. And in Africa, you don't talk about half sisters, step anything. They're all part of the same family. So these are my 3 children, and I have 5 grandchildren, 3 by him and 2 by her. And Brianna, who was the product of my marriage with my husband, Fernando, is quite a character, living in Scotland, has been there for 11 years, went to the University of Edinburgh, and never came home. And Fernando lives in Mozambique, and Luana lives in Angola. So I have quite a global family that all of them moved very far away from me. I asked why, but ballet and why dance is in the title. Dance was very important to me. My mother loved dance. She loved ballet, and she enrolled me in ballet school when I was 4 in New York, where we were living at the time. 4 or 5 somewhere. These 2 women, Doris Jones and Claire Haywood, started a school in Washington, D.C. in 1941. And the reason they started the school was because the one on the right, Doris Jones, became quite a tap dancer, was from Boston, but she wanted to become a ballet dancer. And there was nowhere for her to study ballet in Boston during segregation. She was able to find a teacher who allowed her to come in the back door when the white teachers left, when the white students left out of the front door. And she gave her some private classes. But she decided that the importance of the discipline of dance, the musicality, the sense of the core and teamwork, timing, placement, that all of these things were life skills that were important to children, and particularly children of color, who might have some barriers in life and have some challenges, that learning a classical art form was going to be helpful to them. Arthur Mitchell, whom some of you may have heard of, who started the Dance Theater of Harlem, who was the first Black dancer, principal dancer in the New York City Ballet, was someone who had a relationship with our school through George Balanchine, the Russian who transformed ballet in America. Balanchine did put Arthur Mitchell into the New York City Ballet, and he also mentored my teachers. He came to Washington. He mentored them, and it was interesting because I have a passage in the book that talks about Lincoln Kirsten and George Balanchine started New York City Ballet and the School of American Ballet. But in the 1930s, when Balanchine came here, his dream, and it's in writing and in a letter that was sent, was to start a company that was 50% white and 50% Black. And of course, he couldn't do that in the 30s. So what he did do, which people don't give him enough credit for, in my view, was he did really believe in diversity. People think that he came here and he restructured that you had to be this thin and you had to have legs up to here and you had to have certain proportions to your body that most dancers have. I think it's true, but what he did was he recognized the individuality and the talent that could come from someone who did not have a certain number of inches between the ear and the shoulder. He had, for example, a very tall dancer, Maria Tallchief, who was a Native American, whom he married among the other women he married. He had quite a few he married, and they were usually his muses. They were dancers. And he also mentored my teachers, and he was able, and he brought people like Mitchell into the company. And when they traveled, he would not allow the company to stay in a place that did not allow Arthur Mitchell to stay there. So he had very progressive thinking that just has not been written about or recognized. And in my research, I was happy to find that because I was curious about why these women, why would this Russian who came to the United States in the 30s decide that these two women who started a school in 1941 were important to mentor, to support. And it is through him that I was given a Ford Foundation scholarship for all of my training years at Jones Haywood, as were 6 or 7 others of us. And we were auditioned by George Balanchine on one of those visits that he came to Washington, D.C. We also were invited to the School of American Ballet in the summers, where there were no other Black students. And he took a couple of 2 or 3 from that group into the School of American Ballet to live and to study. That was way back in the 60s, which was kind of unheard of as well. So Arthur Mitchell became someone who was very important in my life because he was sent by Balanchine to teach us master classes, to check on us to make sure we were making progress. And another thought about a point about Balanchine, in 1950, I think it was 53, he choreographed and staged a ballet called Agon, which is the title of one of my chapters, which was the first time a Black man and white woman had ever danced together on stage. And it was a scandal in New York. It was written about paper. Some people got up and walked out. He particularly choreographed it in a way that it was a very intimate choreographed piece. And he, from an artistic, once again, perspective, he used the hands often or the limbs of the body to cross over so you see white-Black contrast. And he did that on purpose in choreographing the piece. So that's the Balanchine story. Mitchell reappeared in my life a couple of times, including when I was at Vassar College, but I'll get to that. This is Miss Jones and Miss Haywood with one of their star pupils, who's a very good friend of mine and who now runs that school 81 years later, Sandra Fortune Green, who was the prima ballerina in the company that was formed by Miss Jones and Miss Haywood, in which I danced with Sandra, called the Capitol Ballet. But Sandra was the first Black ballerina to compete in international ballet competition from the United States, twice in Moscow, one in Varna, Bulgaria. She did pretty well in those competitions. So she was very important to them, as she is to all of us, and continues to be, as she teaches at 3 schools and runs 1. This is just a photo from the Capitol Ballet where I danced in the 70s. Another one, we did contemporary, we did ballet. We also did tap. And a little bit of everything. We had wonderful choreographers who came as guest choreographers. This was from the Washington Post with a review of a piece that we did. We danced at universities, at theaters around. We've traveled to historically Black colleges and universities to expose them to dance. This is a photo of me at Vassar College. So I went to Vassar College after high school in the DC area. And why didn't I go to Howard University? Or why didn't I go to a Black college? Well, because my dad and my mom felt that it was important for me to go to a school that was representative of the world in which I would live, and that I would understand how to be a minority in a white powered structure, as America was, and somewhat still is. So I got into Vassar, I got into several other schools that were kind of Northeast, whatever, the Seven Sister and some of the Ivy League schools. I went to Vassar. I did not major in dance. He said, don't you dare. Now, there was no major of dance at Vassar at the time. There were classes. There was a company that I danced with, a repertory company at Vassar. We performed, we choreographed, but I majored in Hispanic studies. And I think that's from my mom and the whole concept of Spanish and intercultural and international. So I was Hispanic studies major and did dance all the time, though. Didn't let my dad know. Out of college, I went straight into the Foreign Service. There was a transition and there was a training and an opportunity for me because I won a federal junior fellowship in my senior year in high school. And it allowed me to work for the federal government during college if I kept my grades at a certain level. I worked at the Voice of America, which was part of the U.S. Information Agency. Contrary to what many people think about the Foreign Service, it is not just the State Department. People think Foreign Service and you have to be at the State Department and that makes you a Foreign Service officer. Well, guess what? There are other parts of the government that have Foreign Service officers. USIA is one. That was the cultural and information and media and international exchanges, educational exchanges. That was the U.S. Information Agency. I was a Foreign Service information officer. And before that, I worked in Foreign Service personnel. I worked with Voice of America. I got lots of experience in terms of the various functions of the U.S. Information Agency, which now does not exist. It was consumed by State Department, contrary to my hopes and desires. My first tour was in the Dominican Republic. I couldn't get away from dance. I was doing cultural affairs at the embassy, and by night I was moonlighting as a dancer with the Dominican Ballet Company. So that's one of the things from some pieces that we did on tour actually throughout the Dominican Republic. And I think the ambassador supported it because I was cultural affairs officer. So it allowed me to get into the cultural fabric of the country and to meet a lot of people and to be helpful, I'm sure, in terms of my knowledge of what was going on. I did classical ballet, did contemporary ballet. That's a picture of me from Coppelia. So it was a great opportunity. I went on to Mexico City, where you may remember the actor, some of us who are old enough, John Gavin, who was an actor during the time and who became ambassador as a political appointee, not as a career ambassador, to Mexico. And that's when I was in Mexico for a tour. And then I had an onward assignment to Tanzania. And I was just talking to Phil at the gallery today, at the St. Francis Gallery, where he does so much work in Kenya. Well, I had to learn Swahili in order to go to Tanzania. And I was taught by a Kenyan teacher, which I told him about, which is a little bit different take on, difference in the language. It's a little bit different between the various tribes in Tanzania and in Kenya, but I did not go. And the reason I didn't go to Tanzania after studying Swahili for several months was that this was in 1979, 80, around that time. And it was Reagan administration. It was constructive engagement, which was a policy that was developed at that time that had to do with our relationship with South Africa. We did not support sanctions as a country, as a government. I shouldn't say as a country, as a government, because we did as a very much as a country among advocates who were protesting across the country. I was one of them throughout school, et cetera. And I felt that as the spokesperson, which I would have been, and I would have been one of two people at the embassy to speak Swahili. So I would have been called upon to be out there, a community, policy, activism, media, to support US policy, and I couldn't do it. I had been an anti-apartheid activist. Tanzania was what's called a frontline state. It was among those African countries that were very much against apartheid and that were supportive of sanctions around the world. And that was one big reason I didn't go. There were others. I had a fellowship to graduate school at SAIS. It was a use or lose because I had put it off for 5 years. So I went to Johns Hopkins to get my master's. And there were some family and personal reasons why I thought it was best for me to leave the Foreign Service. So that's what I did. I left and I went into the world of public affairs. And later on, I did that for 11, 12 years. And later on, I went during the Clinton administration to the Commerce Department. Ron Brown was the first Black chairman of the Democratic Party in the United States. He was very supportive of Clinton's run for presidency, and Bill Clinton at Ron's funeral said there were only two people who supported originally at the beginning his run for president, and they were his mother and Ron Brown. And he said that at a church with the casket right there, so I don't think he was lying. So Ron Brown and Bill Clinton were very close friends. Ron became the Secretary of Commerce. I met Ron back in the early 80s when he was a lobbyist and I was a PR executive. We worked on a few clients together, so we'd known each other for a very long time. He's really the one who pulled me into politics, Democratic politics. I did a lot of work with him when he was at conventions in '88 and speeches while he was at the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. I traveled with him to Africa, to Europe for the Liberal International. I was there even though I had a day job. They were very encouraging of us being involved as PR, as public affairs, as advocates in party politics. So I was allowed to do some of those things. Ron was quite a character and a very important guy, a very good leader. He really was someone who crossed party lines and crossed racial lines. Probably had he lived, would have gone much, much further in terms of his political career. At the Commerce Department, I was named by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and my job was as Assistant Secretary and Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. Now say that 10 times. It was the longest title in the history of I don't know what. It was such a long title. But what I did was to promote exports for small and medium-sized companies and to advocate for our big companies that were trying to win contracts abroad against, competing against the French, the British, whomever, and also to run a branch of the Foreign Service, which is called the Foreign Commercial Service. So I had those multiple tasks. I had 90 offices in the United States. I had 130 offices overseas. It was a wonderful experience, quite a management job and a policy job, and I enjoyed it. And Ron was the best, and he died in a plane crash in 1996. He died with several people from the Commerce Department who were staffing him. He died with corporate executives who were going to Croatia and to Bosnia to help rebuild after the war there. I traveled with him extensively throughout Africa and the world. I think that with many of the leaders I had the privilege of meeting, presidents, kings, ministers, I truly lived a very privileged life to have been able to meet all of these people. But the person who impacted me the most was Nelson Mandela. And this was just a few months after he left Robben Island in 1990. We were among some of the first Americans to meet with him. And Ron Brown then, I think, was still chairman of the party. He wasn't yet Secretary of Commerce. So some of these are out of chronological order. In terms of the crash, I do have passages in the book, which I will not read because we'll be slowed down forever, where I talk about the fact that I was in Vietnam opening the first commercial office since the war. with a delegation of business people when the crash occurred in Dubrovnik, Croatia. 34 people died. Some worked for me and with me. And it was so tragic because Ron was a person who believed in opportunity for everyone. He had probably the most diverse Commerce Department, or one of the most diverse departments in the government, I'm sure at the time. Paul London worked there. It was a privilege to have Paul as a colleague at the Commerce Department. Jill Shooker worked there. And Jill and I have been in jobs together for many, many years in various places, including at Commerce. So it's wonderful to have my friends here and to have those relationships that have lasted for decades. So friendships are really important. I was asked to fly to Dubrovnik to recover the bodies and fly home with the bodies, which was a life-changing experience for me. I flew from Vietnam to Dubrovnik. I spent a couple days during the recovery of the bodies. I was asked to, I thanked the President Tudjman of Croatia, got on the plane and flew back 13 hours in a C-130, sitting on a jump seat. And thought about, as I looked out at a sea of 34 flag draped coffins, I did a lot of thinking about my life, about the opportunities I've had, about Ron Brown, and about what I do next. So I stayed at the Commerce Department. I then went on to a corporate job at Iridium, which was a mobile satellite company, which was a wonderful opportunity. Worked in licensing, worked in with lots of CEOs of territories around the world. I went back into the advocacy lobbying world where I was for 15 years. And then Trump was elected. And I've been at this firm, the Livingston Group, for 13 years when he was elected. I was a partner, one of 5 partners, the only woman, the only person of color, the only Democrat. And it was not easy. It got harder after the Trump election because I think people got bolder about expressing their true feelings. And some of the Republicans you thought were moderates, no offense to anyone who's a Republican here, but some of the Republicans with whom I worked, whom I thought were moderates, turned out not to be. And the guy who ran the company was the first Republican lobbyist to come out in support of Trump without the knowledge or consent of the other 4 partners, I must say. So I felt it was time to go in 2018, and I retired after a 42-year career. And the retirement brought me the thought of it, which may have been a bit overdue in terms of staying at the firm. But a lot of things happened to me that year in terms of my thoughts about the future. Things happened that weren't just serendipity. I think, once again, they were meant to happen. And I reconnected to the cultural passion that I had. I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi where I talked about the importance of culture, arts in communities, marginalized communities. I met some artists there. One I ended up representing after some time. And I was on a panel where I was introduced as a metaphorical Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges is still alive, and we are exactly the same age, which makes it very interesting, her own experience, and quite relevant. Was a little girl in Louisiana who, after the desegregation of schools was mandated by law, was walking into an integrated school in Louisiana and was spat upon, was called a nigger. One little girl marching in with federal marshals around her. And it inspired, and where were we this morning but seeing the home of the painter who painted this piece, which you all know who it was? Norman Rockwell. So Norman Rockwell, from this photo, was inspired to paint a painting, which had really quite striking. I don't have a picture of the painting because I couldn't put it in my book because you have to be licensed and pay a lot of money to do that. But what I could do was to have this photo, which is public domain. So I thought about it when I was introduced as a metaphorical Ruby Bridges. I was like, me? How could you say that about me? When I thought about my life and integrating schools in Maryland, going to an all-white college, being in very white spaces professionally all of my life, being the only or one of very few women of color. And so it kind of hit me that maybe it was time for me to do something I really wanted to do and stop feeling I had to break barriers and run 100-yard dashes all the time. So I retired and I went back to my passions in the world of dance and in the arts world. People like Misty Copeland, I brought to my dance school to inspire some of the students there. She's lovely, and she really is very appreciative of the fact that there were Black ballerinas like Sandra Fortune, myself, and others. Dance Theater Harlem was way before she got her fame, and she realizes that she stood on the shoulders of many Black dancers. This was a gentleman I met in Abu Dhabi and ended up representing him in the US to expand his footprint. He is the nephew of the famed architect Koolhaas, who is the Frank Lloyd Wright of Europe. He does murals, and this was a mural that I got commissioned for him on a building in Denver. And we were all standing outside looking at it, and he brought some artists from Brazil and from North Philly, where he's done fabulous murals, but always in communities that are marginalized. He doesn't do work unless he feels he can bring community members in and have them exposed. This is Sandra Fortune Green today. You saw her in her little tutu a few photos back. She now owns the school and teaches at Jones Haywood. I also teach there. I went back to the school where I grew up to teach. I teach there 3 times a week, and have really engaged in a lot of work with other teachers in DC, other Black teachers particularly, who teach children of color. This is Kahina Haynes, who's at the Dance Institute of Washington. We try to bring our students together throughout Washington so they'll know each other. They have opportunities for master classes. That's me teaching at Martha's Vineyard a few years ago, where I will be in another 6 weeks teaching again. We take our students there. I've been involved in conversations about diversity in dance and ballet. This was a symposium that I was one of the hosts of a few months ago, with the National Ballet School of Canada. I've been doing cross-border work with the Canadians who are very interested in learning more about the US and diversification. These are students from 5 schools that are part of this collective. And there's a woman in the back, a white woman who's had one with gray hair, who was our pianist, who was wonderful. But the one next to her is Mavis Staines, who was a fabulous dancer. She is the artistic director of the National Ballet School of Canada. And we have a partnership. I was just in Toronto a couple weeks ago, teaching and visiting and talking about my book. I talked about my book with teachers in training. And so that's it. I will read a passage from the very end of my book that I think explains why dance and why my life are connected, if I can only find it. And I think that throughout the book, I made a real effort to make that connection. There's a dancer, an Australian dancer, whose name is Toni Bentley, and she's also a writer. And I will say that my love affair with dance has sustained me, given me strength, and has been a lifelong guiding force, propelling me to summit many mountains. Finally, I am the master of the dance in my dash. I now can select the music, movement, venue, choreographer, principals, corps de ballet, and even the audience. And Toni Bentley said, I learned that discipline is not negotiable. Grace is a consequence of humility. Devotion to something greater than oneself is salvation. So I'll end on that note and take any of the comments, questions. And I'm very grateful. Mary.
What a wonderful career. I mean, really, you are fortunate, but I just wondered, have you spent any time at Jacob's Pillar? Because we have so many dancers.
Oh, I know. I've only been here one other time with Paula and Paul. I did take a class with Paula while I was here. I have not had the pleasure, the time, unfortunately, while I was working, and also always in the summers. Now I probably have that ability. I'm here now, but programs don't start till next week, and I won't be here next week. So I told Paula today, I said, I want to come back so that I will have the ability to stay for a little while and really enjoy the performances. Didn't we see a performance the last time I was here? We saw one dance performance, didn't we?
Yes, we did, and we happened to have the classical ballet teacher I was telling you about, Ian Spencer Bell, who will be teaching starting next Wednesday.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Actually, not next Wednesday,
Oh,
for the next 2 weeks and out.
Ah,
And
fabulous.
we'll connect and talk about that.
It's so wonderful to meet you.
You have to ask a question then.
I don't have a question as much as I just want to say this is very inspiring.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. I do have some stories about inspiration or identification with this. There was, you'll appreciate this, Ian. I went on Tuesday night to a performance at the Kennedy Center in Washington, which was curated by the International Association of Blacks in Dance and something called Memoirs of Black Ballet Dancers, called Ma Ballet, two organizations. And it was a program with Black ballet companies, Dance Theater of Harlem, and a few Collage and a few other lesser known companies. And there was what we call a pickup company, when it's dancers who are just brought in for a performance. But it was all Black ballet dancers who dance with white companies around the world. And so there was a dancer from Monte Carlo, from the ballet in Monte Carlo, whom I happen to know. They're sisters, and they're quite famous. One is particularly famous, named Precious Adams, who is just amazing. You've heard of her. It was Precious Adams and her sister Portia. Portia's in Monte Carlo and Precious is in London. There were two dancers from the Washington Ballet. There were dancers from several other companies, and it was breathtaking. It was a new piece choreographed by Donald Byrd, right on the spot in 2 weeks, and they performed it, and it was just amazing. And I sat there thinking, did I ever think I'd ever see that when I was 5 years old, or when I was 15 years old, or when I was 20 years old? I never thought I'd be sitting at the Kennedy Center seeing these fabulous ballet dancers, Black ballet dancers, who in my time would never have had that opportunity. And it was, it's breathtaking to me. It really brings tears to my eyes. But it was wonderful. They were fantastic. I know they'll never be together again because they're with their companies. They're going back to their companies around the world. But what an experience. And talking to Portia, who is one of those people who contacted me and said, I was inspired by your book. And we've become fast friends. She said, Lauri, I've never felt this way. I've never been in a situation where I've been around fabulous professional Black ballet dancers, where I don't feel I'm competing, where I don't feel the pressure, where the choreographer is Black, where the music is by a Black musician, and where other Black companies are performing. She says, this is something I don't even know how to say what the impact has had on me. And that's, I think, important, as we progress as a country, as an art form, and in many genres. Did you have a question?
I did, yeah. First of all, lovely presentation. Thank you. Very interesting and articulate. Unfortunately for you, I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm interested in in psychology, and so many people struggle around the transition, anticipating retirement and then actually moving into it. And you spoke just briefly about that transition. I was wondering if you could say more about how you found your way from being, so high-powered and busy into retirement. I mean, obviously you're still very busy.
Sure. I talk about it a little bit in the book and the psychological effect of stress. And the fact that I was really stressed out. I really was. It was very difficult to go into the office every day as a partner. In our business, you have clients that you don't always agree with, but you have a responsibility because you're taking their money to perform and to do the best you can for them. And also to have political views that were not always mine, and that often were, had to suffer insults about political issues and also discriminatory remarks as the only one there. I finally got fed up. I got to the point where I said, why is it that you have to continue to do this, Lauri? Now, you can get fed up and you can be in a position where you can't afford to stop working. But thank goodness I was in a position where my kids were out of school. I was divorced. I would have been frugal and had saved money. And I knew that I could survive. I thought maybe I'd get a couple consulting contracts, which I have, but I knew I didn't have to. And I wouldn't be, living under a bridge. So in really going through, I didn't just decide one day. I mean, this was a process I went through. And in many ways, I felt I should have done it much earlier because of the stress levels, and the manifests itself in health issues, high blood pressure, all kinds of things. So I said, I'm young enough to get it together and to enjoy and relax a bit more. Not that I have. For the last 4 years, I've been going like full speed, but on things that I want to do. And and I know it's hard for many people. I haven't regretted it one day. Not at all. Thanks for asking.
And your father must be very proud of the trajectory in the end of your life.
I think he is. My father was very tough. He was a tough father. He was very demanding. He had very high expectations, but I think it helped to make me who I am. And I do think he's very proud, and he said that. At age 90, he can now say it. Is there another question, Jill?
Yeah, I just following up on the transition, Lauri, and your deep involvement in foreign policy, and I know you've given this a lot of thought about the issue of cultural diplomacy. And you touch on it certainly in your book and various conversations that you've had about the book. The impact of the change in terms of, as you were commenting, that the sisters, that they no longer feel like they're the only, or that they have to compete against each other. Where do you see the potential conjunction with cultural diplomacy, foreign policy, how the United States can do better, and how this has changed through time?
Thanks for asking. I've talked a bit, and I need to write a bit about it, the whole concept of cultural competence, which I think is very lacking in our foreign policy. And it encompasses a lot of things in my mind. Cultural exchanges and the fact that the arts, whether they are spoken art or silent art, like ballet has been, it's changing, because on stage at the Kennedy Center, there was actually there were parts of these ballets where they actually said something. And I was shocked, But these art forms are universal. The messages are transferable. And the whole concept of storytelling, which seems to really be becoming, a term of art now. Everyone wants to tell stories and storytelling. Well, guess what? Storytelling through the arts has always been there, particularly in dance. They're all stories that are being told in ballets. They're all stories that inspire choreographers. So I think the whole concept, even from the time that I was a Foreign Service officer in cultural affairs, where I was dealing with cultural exchanges. I took Zubin Mehta and his wife all around the Dominican Republic when they came with the New York Philharmonic. You know, I did exchanges where students came to Mexico. Alvin Ailey came to Mexico. So I had the great job and was able to see firsthand what the impact was of cultural exchange and of the universality of art. I believe that we need to continue down that path, that we're doing more of it by having artists, the globality of art, the presence of technology that connects us, even during COVID, to be able to sit down and see dance performances that were happening in France or when could we have done that if we weren't traveling to these places? So now that we have the technology to connect us and to be able to see and experience, take classes. I took classes from a guy in Hong Kong. I took ballet classes twice a week from a guy who was with the Hong Kong Ballet. So in my living room. So these kinds of things that have brought us closer together and have us realize. Now, the other part of the cultural competence is that I believe that we in our foreign policy mechanism need to be more knowledgeable and do our homework and our research about other countries' cultures. Because when you go into negotiate or you formulate a foreign policy relationship, a bilateral policy or whatever, and you don't really understand culturally, socially, the culture and the nature of that country. And it's not just about language. I'm not saying you have to speak Russian and Chinese and everything. It's not just about language. It's about doing your research, studying and understanding how you approach in a negotiation, in a meeting, that person across the table from a knowledge of the cultural reality, history, social, how they live, what they believe in. That's going to help us in our foreign policy. And Americans traditionally, unfortunately, have been pretty arrogant about our way and how people need to speak English and how people need to accept America as the power, you know, the primary power in the world. Well, power dynamics are changing. And with that, I think we need to develop more cultural competence in how we think about foreign policy and how we implement it. And I also believe the last point is that artists should be incorporated more in strategic thinking about these things, because artists are very creative in their thought process. A lot of times policymakers are more narrow in looking at policy or looking at trade, economics, whatever it is, from a very kind of laser focused, narrow perspective. Artists don't do that. And frankly, when you see people, and I'll point to Paula, who's a trade expert and who's a sculptor, I think that even in her interpretation of trade, she's bringing a creative dimension because she's going to think about it broadly because she sculpts. You know, when I was a Foreign Service officer, I think I was looking at things sometimes from a more creative perspective at the table and bringing thoughts into the discussion that came from my background of dance and the arts. So I really think that artists need to be integrated more and appreciated and sought after for thinking about things that are not considered to be in their realm of knowledge or expertise. I think it would make us a better country. I think it would make us a better world. I think it would make us a more understanding, universal, and on the same page, united as a world if we brought artists more into that dialogue. Paul?
You talked about, it seems to me, in this culture thing, that American culture is powerful all over the world. Even if you don't like American culture, you're sort of bouncing off it. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. I mean, if you see a speech, it's about either you're for the Americans or you're against the Americans. And of course, we know about all the black artists who went to France and had such an enormous impact. So there's a sort of power in American culture that I don't fully understand.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think there's another side of the coin, however. I think that American culture, particularly in areas like jazz, like tap and other dance forms that have come from our cultural reality, which is slavery. Okay. Has that been recognized and accepted? When people talk about jazz music, do they talk about literature and blues? Where have those musicians, where have those dancers had more opportunity? In Europe, particularly during the 50s, 60s, the 30s, 40s, 50s. So the appreciation that Americans have had for this wonderful cultural, these cultural icons, these genres, has not been what it should have been. It's better now. I think we now embrace and we recognize the Dizzy Gillespie's of the world, or the Josephine Bakers who had to flee, or the Paul Robesons who went to Russia because they couldn't get jobs here, because they were, part of the big McCarthy. I won't even go there. Okay, so you have this in terms of American culture that I think is interesting and that people want in Europe and that they emulate, and that hip hop, rap, all over the place. I was in Rotterdam and I went to a rap concert, that young people love and really embrace. And I think American art forms are loved and interesting to the world. And it is a way for us to communicate. But I also think that we don't respect the fact the Chinese have one of the best dance companies, theater companies I have ever seen in my life. Ever. I don't care. All the companies, all the dance I've ever seen. I can't believe how accomplished, how creative, the costumes, the choreography, the music, the everything. So we also have culture, and culture much older than ours, and often more accomplished than some of ours, that's happening in other countries. Whether it's in Brazil and the music that's come from Brazil, whether it's capoeira from Brazil. These are also places that have cultural realities that are extremely important, that have influenced the world. But do we look at those and accept them? Are they mainstream? Yeah, people know samba and they know the girl from Ipanema. That's about it. Flamenco, we're just talking about flamenco dancing. How that has been so influential and so wonderful. Do people know about it? I'm not sure. That masses of people appreciate the art forms, fabulous, the music, the dance. So I think that we have been somewhat cultural imperialists. I just believe that we have been, and that we need to open up and to be more appreciative of other and how it's influenced American culture so much. So I guess maybe because I've lived and traveled throughout the world, and I have been privileged to see, to appreciate all these things, that I'm, it's hard for me to not be able to incorporate this into my thinking, to who I am, to how I would like to see our country expand and open up and think broader and be more appreciative of other cultures. I'm sorry. Did you have
Yeah, I was just gonna pull the
Thanks, Mary.
concept
Thank
of
you
what
so much.
Jacob's Pillar does for our area in terms of bringing in international groups. And I know COVID has shifted inside out a bit, but the number of kids who would not have been introduced to dance groups from around the world, or even from Brooklyn,
Right.
or the Bronx,
Right.
Sadly, it becomes so long to see their neighbors.
Right, and without that concept of all these neighbors from around the world, they can't grasp that everyone's having their own creativity based on their culture, but that's equally culture.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a very poor grasp of geography in our country.
Yes.
there's nowhere else in the world you can travel that has a poorer grasp of geography, I don't think.
Yeah, I think it's getting better. It really is getting better that our kids, and probably because of technology,
That is helpful.
and also in terms of finances of children being taken all over the world when they come from families that can afford it. There's more international travel and exposure. I think we're getting a lot better as a country in that regard, and I do appreciate Jacob's Pillow and the contributions, and it's unbelievable programming and has been for many years.
And there must be others all around the country who are doing similar,
Some
or
of it.
no?
Some of it.
Because that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah. Martha's Vineyard, they have it's not like Jacob's Pillow, but they do have international performing entities. The fact that we take our kids up there almost every summer. We take our kids to France every other year. Yeah, to a school in France that's near, it's near Monte Carlo. That's been there for years. It's a woman named Rosa Hightower. You know the Hightower School. It's famous, real famous. So we take our kids there every 2 years so that they can experience an international environment, being in another country. We haven't taken them the last few years because of COVID. But we do Martha's Vineyard 1 year and we do France the other year. And that's important for them to see what their competition is, to see another culture, to experience another country. But I know that our kids of color are very privileged because they come from middle-class families. Whereas the woman who was pointing and the leg was up at the bar of the little girl, that school is in a very marginalized community where almost all the kids are on scholarship. But the opportunities they've had through this coalition that we've brought together, and they will go, several of our students from that group, the big group, will go to Toronto in November. And the Toronto students will come to DC and they'll live with the family and they'll be dancing with all Black kids or all kids of color, what they've never been exposed to. And our kids will be in Toronto in a school that is one of 2 in North America that you live there, you audition, and at age 11, you go into the school through 18, and you live there, you eat there, you study there, you take ballet and various classes there, the National Ballet School of Canada, but their government supports that big time. So we're exposing and changing, and one day at a time, one child at a time is what I like to think.
That's how music does also. I mean, hip hop is the largest genre worldwide now. It matters. It's, it is a cultural exchange.
It is.
It's unique to hear Korean hip hop or.
Oh, yeah. And
Because we're used to what we hear here.
And it's really good.
There's some great French hip hop, I've got to say. It's amazing. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep you all day. Oh, I'm sorry, did you have another question?
I did. Tell me if it's not appropriate or beyond the scope of this forum, but I'm thinking about your career and all that you described and how often you were the only woman in the room or the only woman of color, and wondering how you bore that. And I'm not thinking of, it's just a question for you as an individual. How did you tolerate that, knowing that a lot of people probably didn't want you in the room or had their own biases about all kinds of things? And so I'm wondering how you managed that over such a long period of time.
Ballet and family. I could answer it just in those 2 words. Ballet instilled in me the discipline, the perseverance, the tolerance for pain. I mean, literally, as you know, Ian, and emotionally. My ballet teachers were really tough on us. It was the old school with the cane and stepping on your toes and telling you that you're never going to be good enough, but supporting you at the same time. My father, my mother, that they were educated and supportive in their own way with tough love. So I was used to being in difficult situations and knowing that I could never give up. And that's stressful too. I'm not telling you it was easy. But I think that this is why I believe that art forms, any genre of art, is important for children, where they can develop that passion. They can turn off. I can walk into, I take ballet classes all over the world. When I was working and traveling all over the world, I would take a ballet class. Universal language, whether I was in Madrid, whether I was in Hong Kong, whether I was in South Africa. You can go into a ballet studio, you know that everybody in that ballet studio knows the same language that you know. And you can turn off for 90 minutes. You can just turn everything, put everything out of your mind for 90 minutes at the bar, in the center. You listen to the teacher, you know, maybe some things you can't do, may not be your right level, but basically I could walk into any studio in the world and really be able to let go. And that's why I say ballet, or whatever it is, music, whether it's art, you know, being able to find a passion, doesn't have to be in the arts, but I would highly recommend for children it's in the arts, where you're able to compartmentalize and just know that for that amount of time, nothing else matters. So I think it was ingrained in me as a very young child.
Thank you